Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shannon Razadin, and I have the incredible honor and privilege of serving as the President and Executive Director of the Military Family Advisory Network, MFAN for short. Over the course of the last 9 years, MFAN has committed countless hours to understanding what's going on in military families' lives. Where do military families need more support? And through this research and the incredible work of our advisory board, we've really been drawn to food insecurity and understanding if military families are food insecure and really what's behind that. Since 2017, we've been looking at food insecurity in this community. And as we've learned more and more, we've learned that we have more to learn beyond that. So we've committed to really understanding the causal factors that lead military families to the point of being food insecure. In a few minutes, I'm going to introduce our Director of Research and Program Evaluation, Dr. Gabby Lesperance. But before we do that, I want to say thank you to our incredible supporters of this research effort. In our Texas market, we worked with Bob Woodruff Foundation. Thank you to Bob Woodruff Foundation for the incredible support there. And in Tidewater, Virginia, we worked with Wounded Warrior Project. Thank you for your incredible support.
At the Bob Woodruff Foundation, we find, fund, shape, and accelerate equitable solutions that help our impacted veterans, service members, and their families and caregivers thrive. We're dedicated to improving the overall health and well-being of the military and veteran population, and to ensuring that communities across the country have the resources and capacity to meet their needs wherever they are. The COVID-19 pandemic brought food insecurity rushing to the forefront of the national conversation. We know that it's not a new issue. As you know, MFAN has done an extraordinary job confirming that veteran and military households experience food insecurity at rates higher than other Americans. And while BWF's network of community partners reported that while 87% of them were serving veterans with food and nutritional needs, only 27% of those community efforts could completely satisfy those needs. These numbers are alarming. They're also a call to action. We need to understand the challenges that contribute to military and veteran food insecurity so that we can be a part of a longer-term solution. That's why the Bob Woodruff Foundation has been proud to partner with the Military Family Advisory Network in support of their research looking at causal factors for military family food insecurity in the state of Texas.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Peterson with the Wounded Warrior Project Community Partnerships and Investments team. I'm so happy to be here with you all as we celebrate the launch of this pioneering research. I want to begin by thanking our partners at the Military Family Advisory Network for their partnership and their commitment to our nation's military and veteran families. We have had a complementary journey with MFAN on understanding families and their needs more comprehensively. Wounded Warrior Project has been a proud partner of MFAN since 2018, and in those years, we've worked together to address some of the most complex challenges facing military families, chief among them, food insecurity. Wounded Warrior Project's funding has helped to power MFAN's food distribution events, as well as its Military Family Support Survey, two initiatives that are so foundational to our understanding of hunger in the military and veteran population. But we knew we had to go deeper. If we truly want to end food insecurity, we have to understand the root causes, the nuances of daily life in local communities like the Tidewater region. The causal factor research released today accomplishes exactly that. With this data as our guide, we can design programs, services, and networks of support that make meaningful change for military families. The task ahead is formidable, but I am optimistic that with this data in hand, we can make real and lasting progress one step at a time. Once again, on behalf of Wounded Warrior Project, thank you to our friends at MFAN for their partnership, and I so look forward to today's presentation. Thank you.
It is difficult for people to talk about food insecurity. Over the course of the last 18 months, MFAN staff members spoke to 312 military-connected families who are experiencing food insecurity. As we worked up to this research release, we sought out families who might be willing to share their stories. What we heard time and time again is that people were not comfortable. People were not comfortable talking about it publicly because there is that feeling of stigma and shame. We are here today to, one, help us all understand the causal factors that lead to food insecurity among military families, but also to shift the culture and promote the help-seeking behavior. These families were incredibly brave sharing their stories with us, and we are forever grateful. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Gabby Lesperance, and she's going to bring us to these findings. Thanks, Gabby.
Shannon, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm so excited to share the valuable findings from this research with all of you. Over the last year and a half, MFAN and our partners at the University of Texas at Austin's Institute for Military and Veteran Family Wellness have conducted more than 300 phone interviews with military and veteran families throughout Texas and the Tidewater region of Virginia, all of whom have experienced food insecurity. To measure food insecurity, we've adopted the USDA 6-item short form food security scale. This scale that is validated to measure food insecurity presents 6 statements to respondents that people may have made about their food situation. Any affirmative answer to these responses or these questions indicates on some level that a family is experiencing food insecurity. The scale measures marginal food security with 1 affirmative answer, food insecurity with 2 to 4 affirmative answers, and hunger with 5 or 6 affirmative answers. After confirming incidences of food insecurity with the scale, we analyzed the stories that families shared during their interviews, searching for common themes and sub-themes in the data. The goal of this data analysis was to better understand the causal factors of food insecurity, or those upstream moments in a family's journey that, if avoided, could have lessened or even eliminated their experiences with food insecurity down the road. We found that military and veteran families experience a somewhat common journey through food insecurity. They experience a causal factor that catalyzes their food insecurity. They struggle to afford and provide balanced meals. They experience stigma around being food insecure. They rely on support mechanisms. They utilize resources to make ends meet, and they experience barriers to food security. As we look at the personas that have come out of our data, we realize that they're all dictated by their causal factor. We've identified 6 causal factors and generalized personas of military and veteran families experiencing food insecurity. 4 core personas that span the experiences of families in Texas and the Tidewater region of Virginia, as well as 2 distinct personas that represent the lived experiences of families in each location individually. The 4 core personas are families that experience spousal unemployment, growing families, families that have recently incurred unexpected expenses, and families who have recently PCS'd. In Texas, we heard stories of families who had experienced an unexpected external system shock, an uncharacteristic ice storm that swept the state in February of 2021. In Tidewater, families are telling us that they're experiencing food insecurity due to rising cost of living and a pay that just does not keep up. There's so much to share about military and veteran family experiences, and there's no better way to do so than to share their stories as they were told to us with all of you. As we explore each persona in turn, we will introduce you to families who have offered to share a piece of their story through quotes in our presentation. We're excited to get started. Overwhelmingly, the most common causal factor for military and veteran family food insecurity is spousal unemployment. This could be unemployment, underemployment, or even an inability to maintain consistent employment. And the causes vary. It could be due to a recent PCS, due to COVID-19, or even due to high childcare costs. Regardless, we see that pre-existing spousal unemployment isn't an issue until compounded by a variety of other factors that ultimately lead a family down a path towards food insecurity. In the quote on your screen, you hear from the spouse of an active duty service member in Tidewater, Virginia, who, despite ample qualifications, struggles to find employment because she's the primary caregiver for her children. Existing on a single income becomes unsustainable and makes all food, much less balanced and nutritious food, difficult to afford. The situation these families find themselves in hurts their pride and makes it difficult to ask for help or seek out resources. Nevertheless, they budget, they rely on food drives and food banks, and unfortunately, they simply let the kids eat first in the face of food insecurity. Our second persona of military and veteran family food insecurity is that of a growing family. Growing families experience a different causal factor of food insecurity than those experiencing spousal unemployment. For families who have mentioned having a child within the past 12 months before their interview, unemployment wasn't the causal factor. Instead, having kids within the past 12 months leads to things like spousal unemployment throughout their journey. Once a family brings another child into the home, their expenses grow, and childcare costs often lead spouses to forego employment outside the home. Limited to a single income, they constrain their budgets, but they still face expensive bills, unexpected expenses, and a rising cost of living. These families tend to prioritize paying bills over buying food, and they do so even with awareness that they're ineligible for benefits like SNAP. We heard from a spouse of an active duty service member quoted on your screen who explained her experiences trying to get food stamps, saying that to them, we're making too much money, whether we're starving or not. These families worry for their children's healthy growth and development, but are unable to afford the healthy food that they would prefer. Similar to families experiencing spousal unemployment, growing families rely on food drives and food banks. They budget and they rely on their extended family. Unlike other personas, these families often utilize WIC, and that helps to cover some of the gaps in their groceries. Unfortunately, it's still not enough. Even with WIC support, these families still experience food insecurity. This third persona of military and veteran family food insecurity is those families who have recently PCSed. When describing experiences over the last 12 months, our next group of families faced issues that stem directly from their recent permanent change of station. These families moved during COVID, often when kids were home from school, and although they had no long-term struggles with food insecurity, meaning that their food insecurity wasn't present before their recent PCS, they do recall that things were previously difficult, whether that was because they were at lower ranks, growing their families, or simply facing benefit ineligibility. They remembered having trouble bringing things together in their budget previous to their food insecurity. But after they moved, they were forced to find housing in a tight housing market. And once they did, they faced slow and incomplete reimbursements during their move. And they became forced to rely on credit cards to choose the unhealthy food options and to look for sales whenever they can. One active duty spouse in Texas describes the huge burden on her family's finances in the quote on your screen. Only adding to the financial burden, families struggle to afford childcare, and spouses are often forced to experience prolonged unemployment until suitable solutions can be found. When they do seek outside support, they rely on food banks and food drives to make ends meet. And when searching for further support, they rely on friends, family, and their community. These families, interestingly, most often cited resistant or unhelpful command structures in their times of need, which only contributed to the stigma they felt around asking for help. These families were largely ineligible for SNAP, but they wanted more information about local resources, and they needed the barriers to finding childcare to be lowered. Our final core persona are those families that have incurred unexpected expenses. Families in this persona have recently incurred unexpected expenses, often associated with their vehicles or family's pets, and these expenses set them back financially and deepen their food insecurity. Families in this persona didn't necessarily experience long-term food insecurity, but they had large pre-existing burdens on their finances. When discussing experiences over the last 5 years and 12 months, these families spoke about unemployment for the spouse and for the service member. They had absorbed the cost of growing families, and became hard-pressed to afford childcare, and all of this was pre-existing when they experienced unexpected expenses. Interestingly, these families are more likely to provide ongoing care for extended families and have immediate family members with ongoing medical conditions. Over the past year, these families experienced an unexpected expense that put undue strain on their budget and finances. We heard from an active duty spouse in Tidewater, Virginia, who struggled to afford veterinary care and vehicle maintenance during her spouse's deployment. When families were forced to incur these unexpected expenses, they were pushed into food insecurity. In the face of these hurdles, families struggle to provide balanced meals for their families, and they struggle to afford the healthy food. But they recognize that healthy food also doesn't last as long as processed food does. And so instead of relying on and providing healthy food, they rely on canned food and choose frozen options when possible. To relieve the strain on their families, while recognizing that they're ineligible for benefits like SNAP, respondents sought jobs, they relied on family, they used their credit cards, and they ultimately let the kids eat first. Families in this persona rely heavily on food banks and food drives to provide food for their families, and despite continuing to use these resources, their extended families are their most effective support system. When discussing the hurdles they face to getting the support they need, respondents were aware of the ineligibility of benefits, particularly SNAP, but they did not know where else to find resources when they finally do overcome the stigma and ask for help. These 4 core personas, spurred by the causal factors of spousal unemployment, growing their family, recently PCSing, and incurring unexpected expenses, were common across participants in both Texas and Tidewater, Virginia. But interestingly, we found 2 more causal factors that were location specific. In Texas, the data show us a persona of families that were on the edge between being food secure and food insecure. They were living in an area that experienced one system shock, an uncharacteristic ice storm that disrupted their balance and shifted them into food insecurity. They're struggling to get themselves out of the episode of food insecurity that followed the storm. The quote you see here from an active duty service member in Texas summarizes the story we heard time and time again of military and veteran families and their communities being unprepared for the uncharacteristic ice storm and being unable to financially recover. When discussing their experiences with food insecurities, the families that fit this persona mentioned struggling with COVID. They were caring for extended family members and experiencing medical conditions that were straining the family budget. The budget was tight because families were experiencing things like spousal and service member unemployment. But despite all of these experiences, they didn't have struggles putting food on the table until an uncharacteristic ice storm sent a shock through their local system. Neither they nor their community were prepared for the storm, and it set them down a path towards food insecurity. In the time following the ice storm, there were no food in stores, balanced or otherwise. And to address this problem, they let the kids eat the food that they already had in the house first. In this time of need, these families turned to their broader community for support. They mentioned community-specific resources, community-hosted events, and relying on neighbors and friends. When reflecting on this time on their lives, the family cited logistic hurdles to finding adequate support, but also noted a general resilience both for themselves and in the community. Our final persona is those in families in Tidewater, Virginia, who have experienced a rising cost of living. People are experiencing a rising cost of living and struggling to afford the things that they were able to afford before because the pay has not risen to meet growing inflation. These families cited a gradual rise of cost of living over the last few years, but didn't experience food insecurity until recently. Over the last 5 years or so, they experienced struggles brought about by the military lifestyle, including deployment, transition, and homecoming struggles. But within the last year or so, the rising cost of living had led them down a path towards food insecurity. This, coupled with things like recent PCSing, no food being available in the stores, and the fact that food is just becoming more expensive, put a strain on their family budget. These families struggled to provide balanced meals and realized that healthy food simply costs more. To overcome these hurdles, families rely on internal mechanisms like eating cheap food, putting things on their credit card, stretching the food whenever possible, shopping sales, and buying generic. And these families are less likely to seek support at food banks and food drives. But when asked what kind of support they would like to have, they mention more information about available resources, classes about solutions, and employment support. Ultimately, these families recognize that the root of the problem is a rising cost of living that is outpacing their pay. As you can read in the quote from an active duty spouse in Tidewater, Virginia, prices have gone up. Families aren't operating on a single fixed income, and they can no longer afford the healthy options they would like to feed their kids. In the stories families have shared with us, we hear time and time again that there are a few common support systems that they need. They want information about support system and resources both locally and nationally. They want affordable, accessible childcare. They want to be eligible for SNAP benefits. They need to experience reduced costs in PCS, and ultimately they need higher pay. I'm going to pass it back to Shannon now to discuss our conclusions and recommendations. Shannon?
Thank you so much, Gabby, for eloquently sharing these experiences of military families. Thank you to our research team for the time that you put into this effort. And also really a big thank you to the military families who bravely shared their experiences with us. Without knowing this and knowing your journey, we would not be able to put the solutions in place that are required to get at the root causes of food insecurity among military families. So with that, I'm going to talk through a few recommendations that our organization has put together as we think about how we get ahead of this. One, reducing stigma and promoting the help-seeking behaviors. As we've navigated the Million Meals Challenge and our support around military family food insecurity broadly, we've frequently heard that this is not a problem. We've heard that this is an issue related specifically to budgeting. We now understand that this is a broad issue with a variety of causal factors that bring families to the point of having to choose between paying for food and paying for other key important life expenses. So now, how can we all work together to shift this culture, to promote help-seeking behavior, and make sure there is room and a safe space for military families to ask for help, and that we're getting them connected to the resources that they need? The second, lessen the burden of a PCS. We know from previous research efforts that military moves are incredibly expensive, and there are a lot of out-of-pocket expenses that military families incur. How can we make sure that the reimbursement process is moved through as quickly as possible? And then in some cases, how can we make sure that there is money up front that people can utilize as far as stipends so that they don't have to dig into their emergency savings or go into credit card debt when they are going through a military move? The next one, mitigate barriers to dual income earnings. Military spouse unemployment and underemployment is a really key factor in understanding the causal factors of food insecurity. How can we put solutions in place that allow military spouses to achieve a stable income? As we think about childcare, as we think about the flexibility that's required for military spouses, as we think about portable careers, how can we all work together to make sure that these solutions are in place so that military families can achieve a dual income household, which is so important in mitigating food insecurity? The next, enhance benefit eligibility. So Gabby mentioned SNAP and how many families were finding that they were unable to access SNAP benefits because the basic allowance for housing was factored in as income. That's a challenge that we need to get through. In the immediate term, we can look at the basic needs allowance and how that is structured so that families can access that support. But we really need to make sure that it's a level playing field so that military families have the access to the support that they need so that they can get healthy food on the table. In Texas, promote importance of emergency savings. So this is in Texas, and this is also other locations broadly, but we know this is specific to Texas because of this research effort. When that ice storm hit, families did not have that safety net, and they were really living on a bubble of just getting by. So what can we do to put systems in place and help educate people on the importance of an emergency savings, and that even saving a little bit can go a long way? We need to work together to make sure that families are also aware of the emergency resources that are out there and available to them, so that when emergencies come up, there are always things that happen in life that are not foreseeable, that they know about those resources before the emergency hits. And then in Virginia and in other places across the country that we didn't specifically look at through this research, right-sizing the basic allowance for housing and ensuring that there is adequate housing availability. We heard in Virginia of families who they were finding the basic allowance for housing was not keeping up with the cost of living in their area, and it was not covering what they needed to cover. We need to really take a look at the basic allowance for housing, how it's calculated, and also the accessibility and availability of housing that's near the military installation. We know that there's not necessarily enough military housing to go around in certain locations, and that is really putting an incredible burden on families. It's adding stress. And as you think about paying for first and last month's rent and paying really beyond your means for housing because you want to be close to installation and a good school system, it's not surprising that those issues would compound and bring families to a point of possibly facing food insecurity. So with that, it's really important to MFAN as an organization that this research does not sit on a shelf and that it's actionable. We want you to ask us questions. We want you to take this information and really dig in so that you can figure out through your organizations, the work that you do, what systems and solutions you can put in place so that we can all get at this together. There is plenty of work to go around. And we really need to get at this as a cohesive, group of organizations in the military community, because no military family should have to choose between paying for their home and paying for food. And no military family should really find themselves in a situation where certain people in their household aren't eating so that others can. So with that, we want to open it up to questions, and please, we're here to answer any questions you might have. And thank you again for your time and attention to this. So with that, any questions?